Which M4 Mac is right for you? The sleek M4 MacBook Air or the heavier but nicer M4 MacBook Pro? Both of these have the same M4 chip, but the performance gap is a little bit larger than you would think in specific tasks. So in this video, we're going to do a deep dive on these, talk about the key hardware differences, and we're going to run these through synthetic and real-world tests to see where the active cooling of the M4 MacBook Pro truly pays off. These have the same configuration. We've got the sky blue M4 MacBook Air. This one is the upgraded 10-core CPU with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. And the MacBook Pro is the 10-core CPU, 16 gigabyte RAM, 512 gigabyte SSD as well. The main hardware differences between these are in the cooling, the displays, and the ports. Both of these do have the same 10-core chip, but it's important to note that if you look at buying the base model MacBook Air, it's going to come in at $1,000 with the 256 gigabyte SSD. The base model of the M4 MacBook Pro starts with a 512 gigabyte SSD at $1,600. MacBook Air uses passive cooling, so there's no fan. MacBook Pro has a single fan in this M4 version of it. They also both have very nice displays, but the MacBook Pro has the liquid Retina XDR, which is a mini LED display that supports ProMotion, so it's going to have 120 hertz scrolling on it. Both of these do have very clear Retina displays, but I really appreciate the brighter screen of the MacBook Pro. On the MacBook Air, you get two Thunderbolt 4 ports on the side of it and a MagSafe port for charging. No built-in SD card slot. There's a headphone jack on the side of it though. On the MacBook Pro, there's three Thunderbolt ports, an HDMI port, and an SD card slot, as well as the headphone jack and the MagSafe port, which I really appreciate the extra Thunderbolt port when I'm keeping a bunch of peripherals plugged in, and I also love having an SD card slot whenever I'm trying to get files off my camera really quick. Also, the speakers are different on these as well. The MacBook Pro has 6 speakers, and it sounds quite a bit nicer than the 4 speakers of the MacBook Air, but the MacBook Air is thinner and lighter. It weighs 2.7 pounds, and the MacBook Pro weighs 3.4 pounds, which doesn't sound like a huge difference, but once you get used to the MacBook Air, you will appreciate the thinner size of it and the fact that it's just a little bit lighter weight whenever you pick it up. Also, the screen on the Pro is ever so slightly larger than the screen on the Air, but I found for day-to-day use, I don't really notice a difference between the 13-inch display and the 14-inch display. I ran a ton of benchmarks on these to see where the performance would start to change. GeekBench 6 is kind of the standard for single-core performance, which is going to emulate day-to-day tasks like browsing the web, email, word processing, things like that. On the MacBook Pro, I got 3,728, and on the M4 MacBook Air, I got 3,717, which is pretty identical. And then on the multi-core score, it was also very similar as well. 14,456 on the M4 MacBook Air, 14,480 on the M4 MacBook Pro. But on the GPU score, I did notice a slight increase on the M4 MacBook Pro. On Blackmagic disk speed test as well, I got almost identical speeds, although for some reason the MacBook Air's SSD tested a little bit faster than the SSD on the M4 MacBook Pro. With the real-world tests, I did start to notice a difference in the performance out of the MacBook Pro, probably because of that active cooling, which kept it from throttling after running for longer. Running the Xcode benchmark, it took 3 minutes and 30 seconds on the M4 MacBook Air, and on the Pro, it took 3 minutes and 2 seconds. I rendered the classroom scene on Blender, and it took 7 minutes and 16 seconds on the MacBook Air, and it took 6 minutes and 5 seconds on the MacBook Pro, so just a little bit faster. On Logic Pro, I tested to see how many total tracks I could run. On the MacBook Air, I topped out at 104 tracks, and on the MacBook Pro, I ran 110 tracks, which is just a little bit more headroom. But on the bounce test, I did see some performance gain. Bouncing 600 tracks in an offline bounce, it took 5 minutes and 15 seconds on the Pro. On the Air, it took 5 minutes and 55 seconds, so a little bit slower because of that thermal throttling. When I bounced a 64-track file, it took 37 seconds with the Air and 34 seconds with the Pro, so not a huge difference in that regard. Next, moving on to video editing. I made a 3-minute project in Final Cut Pro with a couple 6K cameras, exported it down to 4K, and it took 1 minute and 49 seconds on the Pro. It took 1 minute and 51 seconds on the Air, probably because this really uses the video encoders and decoders to make this faster, and both of these have the same number of video encoders and decoders. I did find the performance of going back and forth on the timeline to be very similar on both the Pro and the Air as well. In the real world, both of them perform just fine. The last test was in Lightroom Classic, and I imported 500 raw photos, exported them to JPEG after adding a couple brightness adjustments, some other things like that. It took 9 minutes and 2 seconds to do this on the Air, and it took 2 minutes and 24 seconds on the Pro. So way faster, and it seemed like the Air just really hit that thermal throttling way faster. So if you're trying to decide between the two of these, it's honestly a pretty difficult decision because so many of the real-world tests come in about the same. You really just notice the thermal throttling does start to kick in and slow things down a little bit because these have the same exact chip, but just due to the fan of the Pro. I would say most people should just stick with the Air though because it is so lightweight, so portable, and it runs completely silent without the fan. Especially if you're just doing light, non-sustained creative work where you're just doing exports or renders every once in a while. That's when the MacBook Air is going to be just fine for you. This is great because you still get plenty of power at a low price. But you really should get the MacBook Pro if you want to have the brighter screen, the mini LED screen, the better speakers built in on it as well. If you're running tasks that last longer than 5 minutes like 3D rendering or large photo batch exports, that's when you'll appreciate the power and the fan of the MacBook Pro. And if you really want to have the best possible display with Pro Motion, 120 Hz, the mini LED HDR, that's when the MacBook Pro is going to be a better option as well. And the HDMI port and the SD card slot and the extra Thunderbolt port also always come in hand. So the M4 chip runs great in both of these. I would get the MacBook Air if you're just using this for day-to-day tasks and you need the lightweight, thin design of this while still giving you plenty of power to handle any task, but go all the way up to the Pro if you really want to have the nicer screen, the extra quality of life improvements, and the active cooling for better sustained performance. If you're interested in buying either of these computers, I have links to buy in the description below. If you got any other questions, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear them. Like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any upcoming content.